The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, each word sharper than the last. Next item, gentlemen. One healthy female, aged 19, can cook, clean, and bear children. Opening bid, $200 to settle the Hartwell debt. Emma Hartwell stood on the wooden platform in the center of Millbrook's town square, her hands bound behind her back, her father's shame burning hotter than the Wyoming sun against her skin. The rope around her wrists had rubbed raw during the long night in the jail cell, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation of being displayed like livestock before the leering faces of men who saw her as property to be bought and sold. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, couldn't meet her eyes from where he stood beside the auctioneer's block. His gambling debts had finally caught up with him, and when Silas Crawford came to collect, he demanded more than money. He demanded her. The town council had approved it, calling it a debt settlement arrangement that would keep the family from losing their homestead entirely. Emma had tried to run, but Crawford's men had caught her at the river crossing and dragged her back. $250, called out a voice from the crowd. Emma's stomach lurched as she recognized Jeremiah Walsh, a cattle rancher whose first 2 wives had died under suspicious circumstances. His yellow teeth gleamed as he grinned up at her, already counting his purchase in his mind. $300. Another voice, this one belonging to Marcus Reed, who owned the largest saloon in town and whose hands wandered where they shouldn't when he'd had too much whiskey. Emma closed her eyes and tried to disappear into herself the way she used to as a child when her father's drunken rages filled their small cabin with terror. But even with her eyes shut, she could feel their gazes crawling over her like insects, assessing her worth in ways that made her skin crawl. $350 from Mr. Reed, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear 400? The crowd murmured, some men shifting their weight as they considered whether she was worth the investment. Emma's father cleared his throat, finally speaking for the first time since this nightmare began. She's a hard worker, knows her way around livestock and crops. Never been with a man if that matters to your consideration. Heat flooded Emma's cheeks at his words, the final degradation in a morning full of them. She opened her eyes and stared straight ahead, refusing to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. Whatever happened, she would not let them see her cry. That was when she saw him. At the edge of the crowd stood a tall man in a worn cavalry coat, his dark hair streaked with premature gray and his eyes the color of storm clouds. He leaned against the post office wall, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with an expression she couldn't quite read. Unlike the other men, he wasn't calling out bids or even looking at her like she was something to be possessed. He was looking at her like she was human. Going once at $350 to Mr. Reed, the auctioneer called, raising his gavel. The man in the cavalry coat pushed off from the wall and stepped forward. $500. The crowd fell silent. Even the auctioneer paused, gavel hovering in the air. Emma's heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't believe we've met, the auctioneer said, clearly flustered by the interruption. Jacob Stone, the stranger said, his voice carrying easily across the square, recently discharged from the Union Army. I have the money. Silas Crawford, who had been standing smugly to one side, watching his debt being settled, stepped forward with a scowl. Now, hold on there, stranger. This is a private matter between neighbors. You got no business interfering. Jacob Stone's gray eyes fixed on Crawford with the steady intensity of a man who had seen too much war to be intimidated by a small-town bully. Last I checked, this was a public auction. My money spends same as anyone else's. 600, Reed called out desperately, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. It was clear he didn't actually have that much. 700, Stone replied without hesitation. The crowd began to mutter among themselves. $700 was more money than most of them saw in a year. Reed's face went red, then pale, and he stepped back into the crowd without another word. Walsh spat in the dirt and stalked away, clearly recognizing when he'd been outbid beyond his means. Crawford's face had gone the color of a ripe tomato. This ain't right. This ain't how things are done here. Seems to me things have been done wrong here for too long, Stone said quietly. $700 should more than settle the Hartwell debt with interest. The auctioneer looked between Crawford and Stone, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. Well, the highest bid is $700 from Mr. Stone. Going once, going twice. This ain't over, Crawford snarled. But he didn't raise the bid. He couldn't. $700 was more than he'd lent Thomas Hartwell, more than the homestead was worth, more than anyone in Millbrook could reasonably afford. Sold to Mr. Jacob Stone for $700, the auctioneer announced, his gavel falling with a finality that echoed across the suddenly quiet square. Emma's knees nearly buckled as the reality of what had just happened hit her. She'd been sold like a piece of livestock, and now she belonged to a complete stranger. The rope around her wrist felt tighter, suddenly, cutting off circulation to her hands. Stone stepped up to the platform and pulled out a leather pouch, counting out gold coins into the auctioneer's trembling hands. When the transaction was complete, he climbed the wooden steps and approached Emma with the same careful movements she'd seen her father use around spooked horses. "Easy now," he said softly, pulling a knife from his belt. "I'm going to cut these ropes." Emma flinched despite herself, but Stone's hands were gentle as he sliced through the bindings. When her hands came free, she rubbed her wrists, trying to get feeling back into her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice from hours of silent tears. Stone nodded and gestured toward a horse tied to the hitching post near the general store. "Come on, let's get you away from here." As they walked through the parting crowd, Emma could hear the whispers starting behind them. Some were speculating about who Jacob Stone was and where he'd gotten so much money. Others were making crude jokes about what he planned to do with his expensive purchase. Emma kept her eyes fixed straight ahead and tried to ignore them. Stone helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of town, Emma finally allowed herself to look back at the square where her father still stood, staring after them with an expression she couldn't read. She wondered if she would ever see him again, and found herself surprised that she wasn't sure she wanted to. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, following a dusty trail that wound through rolling hills covered in scrub brush and scattered wild flowers. The sun climbed higher, and Emma's stomach began to rumble with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, and the stress of the morning had left her feeling hollow and shaky. Finally, Stone reined in his horse beside a small creek shaded by cottonwood trees. "We'll rest here," he said, dismounting and offering her his hand. Emma slid down from the horse, her legs unsteady after the long ride. She walked to the creek's edge and knelt down, cupping the cool water in her hands and drinking deeply. When she'd satisfied her thirst, she splashed water on her face and neck, washing away the dust and sweat of the morning. Stone had built a small fire and was roasting strips of dried meat on a stick. The smell made Emma's stomach clench with hunger, but she didn't dare ask for food. She didn't know what this man expected from her. What rights he thought he'd purchased with his $700. "You must be hungry," Stone said, offering her one of the cook strips. Emma took it gratefully, trying not to devour it too quickly. "Thank you," she managed between bites. "What's your name?" Stone asked, settling back against a fallen log. "Emma," she replied, "Emma Hartwell." "Well, Emma Hartwell, I suppose you're wondering what happens next." Emma nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Stone was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his words were not what she expected. "I want you to know that I don't consider you property. What happened back there in that square was an abomination, but it was the only way I could get you away from those men." Emma's eyes widened. "I don't understand. I saw what was happening and I couldn't stand by and watch it. No woman should be sold like cattle, no matter what debts her family owes." Stone's gray eyes met hers across the fire. "You're free to go wherever you want. I won't stop you." For a moment, Emma couldn't breathe. Freedom. The word hung in the air between them like something too precious to touch. "But you paid $700 for me. I paid $700 to get you away from men who would have hurt you." Stone corrected. "That money's gone and good riddance to it. I've got enough to live on." Emma stared at him in disbelief. "I don't know where to go. I don't have any family besides my father," and she couldn't finish the sentence. "He sold me" was too painful to say out loud. "Then you're welcome to stay with me until you figure it out," Stone said simply. "I've got a small ranch about a day's ride from here. It's not much, but it's peaceful and there's plenty of work to keep busy." "What would you expect from me?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stone seemed to understand what she was really asking. Nothing you don't want to give. You'd help around the ranch, same as any hired hand. You'd have your own room, your own space, and if you ever want to leave, you just say the word. Emma felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than despair. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Maybe because I know what it's like to be treated like you don't matter, Stone replied. Maybe because I've seen too much cruelty in this world and I'm tired of standing by and watching it happen. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and Emma found herself studying this strange man who had changed her life with a single bid. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a working man, but they moved with surprising gentleness when he tended the fire or handled his horse. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too much sorrow. But when he smiled, which he had done briefly when she'd accepted his offer of shelter, his whole face transformed. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Stone extinguished the fire and prepared to mount up again. "We'll reach my place by full dark if we leave now," he said. Emma nodded and allowed him to help her back onto the horse. As they rode through the gathering dusk, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time since her father's debts had started mounting, for the first time since Silas Crawford had started looking at her with calculating eyes, she dared to believe that maybe her story didn't have to end in misery. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was exactly what Stone had promised. Small, peaceful, and well-maintained, despite its modest size. A neat cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pastures where a few dozen cattle grazed in the moonlight. There was a barn, a chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that even in the darkness Emma could see was carefully tended. Stone showed her to a small room off the main living area that contained a simple bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest for her belongings. "It's not fancy," he said, "but the roof doesn't leak and it stays warm in winter." Emma ran her hand over the clean quilt that covered the bed, hardly able to believe the space was hers. "It's perfect," she said softly. "There's soap and clean water in the basin if you want to wash up," Stone said. "I'll be in the main room if you need anything. We start early around here, but you can sleep as late as you need tomorrow. You've had a hard day." After he left, closing the door quietly behind him, Emma sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. But these weren't the tears of despair she'd shed in the jail cell the night before. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of sheer exhaustion at having survived the worst day of her life and somehow ending up somewhere safe. She washed her face and hands in the cool water, changed into a clean nightgown Stone had left for her, and crawled under the soft quilt. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving around the main room, banking the fire and settling in for the night. The sounds were comforting rather than frightening, the normal domestic sounds of a home where she was welcome. For the first time in months, Emma Hartwell fell asleep without fear. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon frying. Pale morning light filtered through the single window in her room, and she could hear Stone moving around the kitchen preparing breakfast. Emma dressed quickly and emerged to find him standing over a cast-iron skillet, his back to her. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Emma admitted. "Can I help with breakfast?" Stone gestured toward a loaf of bread on the table. "If you want to slice some of that, I'd be grateful. Coffee's ready if you want some." They worked together in comfortable silence, and Emma found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't thought possible. Stone's movements in the kitchen were efficient, but unhurried, and he gave her space to find her own rhythm without hovering or directing her every move. Over breakfast, he explained the routine of the ranch. The cattle needed to be checked and moved to fresh pasture, the chickens fed, the garden weeded and watered. It wasn't complicated work, but it was constant, and Emma found herself looking forward to having something useful to do with her hands. "I should warn you," Stone said as they finished eating, "word of what happened yesterday will spread. Millbrook isn't that big a town and people talk. Some folks might come around asking questions or making trouble." Emma's stomach clenched. "Silas Crawford maybe, or others who think they have some claim on you." Stone's gray eyes were serious as they met hers. "If anyone comes around when I'm not here, you don't answer the door and you don't go outside alone. Understand?" Emma nodded, fear creeping back into her chest. She'd been foolish to think that escaping Millbrook meant escaping the consequences of what had happened there. As if reading her thoughts, Stone reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. "Hey, you're safe here. I meant what I said yesterday. No one's going to hurt you while you're under my protection." The warmth of his touch sent an unexpected shiver through Emma, and she pulled her hand back quickly. "I should get started on the garden," she said, standing up abruptly. If Stone noticed her reaction, he didn't comment on it. "Good idea. I'll be checking the cattle in the north pasture if you need me." Emma spent the morning working in the garden, pulling weeds, and watering the vegetables Stone had planted. The work was satisfying in a way that surprised her, and she found herself humming as she worked. The sun was warm on her back, and the peaceful sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens clucking in their coop, the whisper of wind through the grass soothed something deep inside her that had been wound tight for too long. Around midday, she heard the sound of approaching horses and felt her blood turn to ice. Stone was still out with the cattle, and she was alone. Following his instructions, she quickly made her way inside and bolted the door, peering out through the curtained window. 3 riders had entered the clearing, and Emma's worst fears were confirmed when she recognized Silas Crawford's voice calling out, "Jacob Stone, come out here. You son of a, we need to talk." Emma pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart hammering in her chest. Crawford had brought 2 other men with him, his foreman and another rancher whose name Emma couldn't remember. All 3 were armed, and all 3 looked angry. "Where is she, Stone?" Crawford shouted. "I know you got her in there. That little belongs to me." The crude words hit Emma like physical blows, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. She'd never belonged to Crawford, had never given him any reason to think she would welcome his advances. But in his twisted mind, her father's debt had made her his property. "She owes me, Stone," Crawford continued. "Her daddy took my money and promised her to me in return. You can't just steal a man's property." Emma closed her eyes and tried to control her breathing. Stone had told her she was safe, that he would protect her, but where was he now? The cattle pasture was half a mile away, too far for him to hear what was happening at the house. Then she heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked, and Crawford's voice took on a more dangerous edge. "I'm counting to 10, Stone. If you don't bring her out here, we're coming in after her." Emma looked around desperately for some way to defend herself. There was a shotgun mounted above the fireplace, but she'd never fired a gun in her life and wasn't sure she could even reach it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely stand. "1," Crawford called out. Emma pressed her back against the wall and tried to think. The back door. Maybe she could slip out and make it to the barn, hide until Stone returned. 2. She crept toward the rear of the cabin, trying to stay below the window line. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor, but every creak of the floorboard seemed to echo like thunder in her ears. 3. Emma reached the back door and slowly lifted the latch. The hinges squeaked softly as she eased it open, and she winced at the sound. 4. She slipped outside and pressed herself against the cabin wall, listening for any sign that Crawford's men had heard her. The barn was only 50 yards away across an open stretch of yard, but it might as well have been 50 me. If they saw her running, she'd never make it. 5. Emma took a deep breath and sprinted toward the barn, her bare feet flying over the packed earth. She was halfway there when she heard one of the men shout, "There she is around back." Gunshots exploded behind her, and Emma felt a bullet whine past her head as she dove for the barn door. She scrambled inside and slammed the door behind her, throwing the heavy wooden bar across it just as someone crashed into it from outside. "Got you now, you little bitch." Crawford's voice was muffled by the thick wood, but the rage in it was unmistakable. Emma backed deeper into the barn, looking around desperately for another exit or somewhere to hide. The building was full of hay bales and farm equipment, but there was nowhere she could go that they wouldn't find her once they broke down the door. The door shook under repeated blows as Crawford's men attacked it with something heavy, probably an axe from the wood pile. The wooden bar was thick and strong, but Emma could see it beginning to splinter under the assault. That was when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves and Stone's voice bellowing across the yard. "Get away from my barn, Crawford." The assault on the door stopped immediately, and Emma heard the sound of running feet as Crawford's men positioned themselves for a fight. She pressed her ear to the door, trying to hear what was happening outside. "This is between you and me, Stone," Crawford shouted. "That girl belongs to me by right. Her daddy owed me money and she's payment. Thomas Hartwell's debt was settled yesterday when I bought her freedom," Stone replied, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "You got no claim on her now." "Like hell, I don't. That auction was a sham and everybody knows it. You got no right to interfere in local business." Emma heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being levered, and Stone's voice turned deadly quiet. "I got the right of $700 in gold in the barrel of this Winchester. Which right you want to test first?" For a long moment the yard was silent, except for the restless stamping of horses and the whisper of wind through the grass. Emma held her breath, waiting to see which way the confrontation would go. Finally, Crawford's voice came again, but the bluster had gone out of it. "This ain't over, Stone. That girl's going to bring you nothing but trouble, and when she does, don't come crying to me for help." "I'll keep that in mind," Stone replied dryly. Emma heard the sound of horses moving away from the barn, and several minutes later Stone's voice came through the door. "Emma, you can come out now. They're gone." Emma lifted the barn and opened the door to find Stone standing in the yard, his rifle still in his hands and his gray eyes scanning the terrain where Crawford and his men had disappeared. When he was satisfied they were really gone, he turned to look at her. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the tension still radiating from his body. Emma shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. The terror of the last few minutes had left her shaking, and she wasn't sure her legs would hold her up much longer. Stone leaned his rifle against the barn wall and stepped closer, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if he wanted to comfort her but wasn't sure if his touch would be welcome. "Easy now, you're safe. They're gone and they won't be back today, but they will be back," Emma whispered, finally finding her voice. "Crawford won't give up, he thinks he owns me." Stone's jaw tightened. "Well, he's about to learn different. Come on, let's get you inside. You look like you could use some coffee and something to eat." As they walked back to the cabin, Stone kept one hand on his rifle and his eyes constantly moving, watching for any sign that Crawford's men might return. Emma found his vigilance both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant he was taking the threat seriously, terrifying because it meant the threat was real. Inside, Stone poured her a cup of coffee and added a generous splash of whiskey from a bottle he kept on the mantelpiece. "Drink this," he said. "It'll help with the shakes." Emma gratefully accepted the cup, wrapping her hands around its warmth. The whiskey burned going down, but it did help steady her nerves. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I brought trouble to your home just like Crawford said I would." Stone sat down across from her, his own cup cradled in his scarred hands. "Emma, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his gray ones, surprised by the intensity she saw there. "You didn't bring this trouble," he said firmly. "This trouble was already here, waiting in the hearts of men like Crawford, who think they can own other human beings. All you did was have the misfortune of being born to a father who couldn't control his gambling and a mother who died too soon to protect you." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes at the mention of her mother. She'd been gone for 5 years now, and Emma still missed her every day. Her mother never would have let her father sell her to pay his debts. "The way I see it," Stone continued, "we got two choices. We can let Crawford and men like him dictate how we live our lives, or we can stand up and fight for what's right." "And what's right?" Emma asked softly. "Your freedom," Stone said without hesitation. "Your right to choose your own path and make your own decisions about your life and your body. That's worth fighting for." Emma stared into her coffee cup, thinking about his words. She'd never had much choice about anything in her life. Not where she lived, not what she did with her days, not even what she ate for dinner most nights. The idea that she could actually choose her own path seemed as foreign and impossible as flying to the moon. "What if I choose to stay here?" she asked quietly. "What if I choose to help you work this ranch and make a life here?" Stone was quiet for a long moment, and when Emma looked up, she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. It wasn't the calculating look she'd seen in other men's eyes when they looked at her. It was something warmer, something that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere desire. "Then I'd be honored to have you," he said simply. But you should know that if you stay, Crawford will keep making trouble. He's got friends in town who will back his play, and he's not the type to let go of a grudge." "What about you?" Emma asked. "What do you choose?" Stone reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I choose to fight for you, Emma Hartwell, for as long as you'll let me." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the cabin and rattling the windows. But inside, by the warm glow of the fire, Emma felt safer than she had in years. Whatever came next, whatever fights lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn. Emma woke to the sound of breaking glass and the accurate smell of smoke. She rolled out of bed and hit the floor as gunshots exploded outside, the bullets splintering the wooden walls of the cabin. Through her window, she could see the orange glow of flames licking at the barn. "Emma," Stone's voice came from the main room, sharp with urgency. "Stay down and get dressed. We need to move." Emma pulled on her clothes as quickly as she could, her hands shaking as more gunshots rang out. She could hear men shouting outside, their voices harsh with excitement and bloodlust. Crawford had come back, and this time he'd brought an army. Stone appeared in her doorway, fully dressed and armed with his rifle and a pair of revolvers. "How many?" Emma asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "At least 6, maybe more," Stone replied grimly. "They've got us surrounded and they're trying to burn us out." The smell of smoke was getting stronger, and Emma could hear the crackling of flames as the fire spread from the barn toward the cabin. "What do we do?" Stone handed her one of his revolvers and a box of ammunition. "Can you shoot?" Emma shook her head. "I've never fired a gun in my life." "Point it at whoever's trying to hurt you and pull the trigger," Stone said tersely. "It's not complicated." Another window exploded inward as a bullet shattered the glass, and Emma instinctively ducked. Stone crept to the front window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. "Crawford's got men positioned all around the cabin," he reported. "They're trying to force us to come out where they can get a clean shot." "Maybe we should surrender," Emma said desperately. "Maybe if I go with them, they'll leave you alone." Stone turned to look at her, his gray eyes fierce in the fire light now flickering through the windows. "I'd rather die than let them take you, and you should feel the same way about yourself." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She was worth fighting for. She was worth dying for. The realization filled her with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Then we fight," she said, gripping the revolver tighter. Stone smiled grimly. "That's my girl." The roof was beginning to smoke now as the fire spread, and Emma knew they only had minutes before the cabin became uninhabitable. Son must have realized the same thing because he started moving toward the back door. "There's a creek about 100 yards through those trees," he said, pointing toward the rear of the property. "If we can make it there, we can follow it downstream and lose them in the dark." Emma nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "What's the plan?" "I'm going to create a distraction at the front door. When I start shooting, you run for the trees as fast as you can. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Just run." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Stone said, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Emma grabbed his arm. "Jacob, I save it for when we're safe," he interrupted gently. "Go." Stone moved to the front window and suddenly opened fire, his rifle barking repeatedly as he sent bullets toward the men positioned around the cabin. Immediately returned fire erupted from multiple directions, wood splinters flying as the walls were riddled with holes. Emma ran for the back door, yanked it open, and sprinted toward the tree. Behind her, she could hear Stone's rifle continuing to fire, punctuated by shouts and returned gunfire. She crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at her clothes and skin, focused only on reaching the creek. She was almost to the water when she heard Stone's rifle fall silent. Emma stopped running and turned back toward the cabin, her heart hammering with terror. The building was fully engulfed in flames now, the roof caving in with a shower of sparks and burning debris. "Jacob!" she screamed, starting back toward the inferno. A hand grabbed her arm and spun her around. Crawford stood behind her, his face twisted with rage and triumph. "Where you think you're going, darling?" Emma raised the revolver and pulled the trigger without hesitation. The gun bucked in her hands, and Crawford staggered backward with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had torn through his shirt. Behind him, two more men crashed through the underbrush, and Emma realized that some of Crawford's men had circled around to cut off her escape route. "You little," Crawford snarled, drawing his own gun with his uninjured arm. "You're going to pay for that." Emma cocked the revolver again, her clear as throat hand steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Stay back," she warned. Crawford laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "You think you're real tough now, don't you? Shooting an unarmed man." "You're not unarmed," Emma pointed out, nodding toward the gun in his hand. "Fair point," Crawford admitted and raised his weapon to aim at her chest. The gunshot that followed was deafeningly loud in the confined space among the trees. But it wasn't Crawford who fired. The man crumpled to the ground as Jacob Stone stepped out of the shadows behind him, snorts his revolver smoking in his hand. Emma had never been so glad to see anyone in her life. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and bearing her face against his shoulder. He was solid and warm and alive, and for a moment that was all that mattered. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his throat. "Takes more than a few outlaws to kill me," Stone replied, though she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "You did good, Emma, real good." Emma pulled back to look at him and saw that his left arm was hanging at an odd angle and blood was seeping through his shirt sleeve. "You're hurt." "Just a scratch," Stone said dismissively, though his face was pale with pain. "We need to keep moving. Crawford had more men than I expected, and some of them got away. They'll be back with reinforcements before long." Emma looked around at the chaos they were leaving behind. The cabin was completely consumed by flames now, along with the barn and most of Stone's possessions. Everything he'd worked for was being destroyed because of her. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "You've lost everything because of me." Stone followed her gaze to the burning buildings, then looked back at her with an expression that took her breath away. "No," he said quietly. "I found everything because of you." Before Emma could respond, he was already moving toward the creek, and she hurried to follow him. They waded into the cold water and began making their way downstream, using the current to speed their escape and the babbling of the water to mask the sound of their movement. They walked for hours through the darkness, following the creek as it wound through the foothills toward the main river. Emma's feet were numb with cold by the time Stone finally called a halt beside a small cave hidden among the rocks. "We'll rest here until morning," he said, lowering himself carefully to the ground. "My arm's about done for, and you look ready to collapse." Emma was exhausted, but she was more concerned about Stone's injury than her own discomfort. By the light of a small fire he'd managed to build with one hand, she could see that the bullet had torn through the muscle of his upper arm, leaving a ragged wound that was still bleeding freely. "This needs to be cleaned and bandaged," she said, tearing strips from her petticoat to use as cloth. Son submitted to her ministrations with surprising patience, though she could see him gritting his teeth against the pain as she cleaned the wound with water from the creek. When she'd finished bandaging his arm as best she could, they sat together beside the small fire, sharing the last of Stone's jerky and trying to plan their next move. "There's a town called Peaceful Valley about 2 days' ride from here," Stone said. "My brother lives there. He'll help us get back on our feet." Emma nodded, though she wondered what kind of life they could build together now that they'd lost everything. Stone seemed to read her thoughts because he reached over and took her hand. "Emma, I want you to know that no matter what happens, I don't regret what we did back there. Crawford got what was coming to him, and you're free now. That's worth any price." Emma looked into his gray eyes and saw the truth of his words reflected there. He really would have given up everything for her freedom, had given up everything without expecting anything in return. The knowledge filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Jacob," she said softly, "when this is all over, when we're safe and settled somewhere new, would you consider marrying me? Not because you bought me or because you feel obligated, but because I think I'm falling in love with you." Stone was quiet for a long moment, and Emma held her breath, wondering if she'd misread the signals, if she'd made a fool of herself by speaking so boldly. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face and making him look years younger. "Emma Hartwell," he said formally, "I would be honored to marry you. Not because I bought you, not because I feel obligated, but because I've been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you standing on that auction block, proud and unbroken despite everything they'd done to you. Emma felt tears of joy spilling down her cheeks as Stone leaned forward and kissed her gently. It was nothing like the rough, demanding kisses she'd feared from men like Crawford. It was soft and sweet and full of promise, a pledge of protection and partnership rather than possession. When they broke apart, Emma rested her forehead against his and whispered, "I choose you, Jacob Stone. I choose this life with you." "And I choose you, Emma," he replied, "now and always." Outside the cave, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the distant sound of running water. But inside their small sanctuary, warmed by firelight and the certainty of their love, Emma Hartwell finally felt like she'd come home. The future stretched out before them, uncertain, but bright with possibility. And for the first time in her life, Emma knew she would face it as a free woman. Loved and protected not as property, but as an equal partner in whatever adventures lay ahead.